Hello, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. You're all welcome to today's panel discussion on food waste. My name is Judith Namanya. I'm a PhD student in ESPP and the Department of Geography. I want to take this opportunity to welcome our panelists. Thank you for accepting to come and lead this interesting and engaging panel discussion on food waste. So on the panel we have Sheril. She's the host for our table at food at MSU and the coordinator of the MSU Food Literacy and Engagement Hall. We have Amanda. She's a PhD student in the Department of Geography, Environmental and Spatial Sciences. We have Phil. He's the Assistant Director of the Michigan Department of Education's Office of Health and Nutrition Services. And we have Sheril. He's the Associate Professor, Department of Supply Chain Management. Food waste. Why should we be here talking about food waste? I mean, all of us are culprits, you know what we do. So I think this was so interesting. When I first came, I went to the dining hall and I was eating as much as I could. Just imagine I had just come from Africa and I'm saying, this chicken, pizza, ice cream. I was eating on everything. But when I was taking my plate, something struck my eyes. People were just, a lot of food was on the plate. And I said, where is this food going to? And then I decided to come back to the dining hall. And why I so shocked my eyes. Someone picks a plate, puts food, eats a little, picks another plate, puts food. It's like they are trying to make sure the money they paid is accounted for. I said, what is this? So food waste is one of the silent problems America is facing today. And what is disturbing is that we put a lot of energy in food production, a lot of water, talking about water scarcity, but we waste a lot of water on food production, only for all that food to end up in the bins, in the landfills. So with that small background, I'll give our panelists 6 to 8 minutes to further introduce themselves and tell us what they do. And I'll open up the discussion to the audience to ask questions, make contributions. Thank you. So, whoever wants to start. Can I start with Amanda?
I'll go first. Hi, I'm Amanda Kreuze. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Geography. And one of my previous jobs before coming back to grad school was working for a waste hauler in Southern California. And one of my main roles was to implement recycling programs, so like mixed recycling programs and also food waste programs at businesses, primarily at restaurants and grocery stores. And the food waste industry, or the waste industry in California, is a lot different than it is here in Michigan. There are laws that require them to have recycling and food waste programs. So they aren't enforced right now, but it does help encourage businesses to start those programs. So, I think this is such an important problem, and we have so much food that's wasted. I think, the first step is just reducing our food waste, having our production meet demands, and then also increasing our donation to help feed people out who are hungry. And then the second step would be, what do we do with this waste? Because I think to some degree we will always have some food waste. So thinking how we can best manage that waste is really important. And right now, I think that composting and anaerobic digestion are two really great options.
Hi everybody, I'm Phil Chase. I'm the Assistant Director for the Office of Health and Nutrition Services at the Michigan Department of Education. My part in this panel is probably to give you more of a K-12 schools angle and to share what I know of the efforts we're working on to reduce food waste. Even though those efforts aren't necessarily centralized, they're not necessarily enshrined in policy, but we do rely on the USDA and other sources to give us some tips and tricks for schools. By and large, we see a lot of friendly behaviors at schools, even if not full implementation. So just to give you a little background of programs that I oversee for the Michigan Department of Education, my office is in charge of all of our child nutrition programs across the state, which include, think school lunch, school breakfast. There's an after-school snack. There's even an at-risk dinner program for at-risk kids. There's actually a good, a nice palette of programs that help students reduce food insecurity, and even outside the boundaries of the classroom. So it's really kind of neat, I guess, mosaic of programs we offer. But what we do is we oversee those on behalf of the USDA. So the USDA, just to give you a thumbnail sketch, because I don't imagine that a lot of you are teachers or you work in a school, but if you do, you may possibly know that these programs are reimbursement programs. We call them entitlement programs. That's how they are officially listed. Entitlement is kind of a dirty word nowadays, so we use reimbursement, which actually does a better job of describing it anyway, because what happens is the schools get reimbursed for their food costs within a certain pricing structure from the USDA. And you probably have heard sometime in your life free and reduced price children, so that would be a reimbursement from the USDA for their food costs. And so you could probably already imagine that schools would have, there's a lot of opportunities for unfortunately, food waste in a school, and a good food service director and their staff will help do a few things, very simple, sometimes simple tips and tricks to reduce food waste. So the two items that are on the back table there, if you haven't gotten one already, there's kind of like a USDA official reference guide that starts the we use to start the conversation with schools, food service directors, as well as the business folks and the school, like the superintendent or principals, to just start talking about getting some awareness of food waste. So that's this one right here. I'm not going to go through every point. I don't think we have time allowance, but there are some really cool concepts on here I am eager to share. And I'll get back to them in a minute, but this just introduces sort of like overview. And then we also really enjoy this one. It's actually from EPA, but we found this really just very helpful because it talks about EPA's food recovery hierarchy, and apologize for the small print on that, but then it goes into reinforcing a lot of the things we talk about from the USDA point of view, as well as the K-12 school point of view. So this is another resource we give food service directors to sort of reduce food waste. And just sometimes by awakening a base level awareness about what happens to the food from their USDA commodities, which are orderable foods you get from the USDA, as well as ones you can purchase, to their production line, to their service line, to their child, to the garbage, just by waking them up on a few basic things, we can reduce food waste in schools significantly. One example is offer versus serve. So offer versus serve is something that's listed about the fourth point on that white piece of paper. And you're like, what is offer versus serve? What is that? Simply put, schools have to offer a meal along a certain predetermined meal pattern. Okay, I won't go into it right now, but just please know that there's a certain amount of meat alternate, a certain amount of grains, a certain amount of fruit, vegetables, and milk. And there's a couple other things in there too. I won't bother to throw it. But they are absolutely able to just give a boxed meal to a child. Perfectly fine. That would be, per the regulations. But a lot of school districts offer choice. So what they do is, out of X number of components you have to offer, you can offer X plus 1 or X plus 2. So the kids would have a choice between chicken or a vegetarian meal, for example, rather than just having to deal with it. Well, you think, well, expanding choice is going to actually make more waste, because what happens to the stuff the kid doesn't choose? Actually ends up reducing waste, because the kids are more apt to eat the things that they see that are attractive to them. So just by that simple idea, we're trying to get, and that's one of several ideas. You can read the rest as we go on with the presentations today. But that's one simple thing we put in front of food directors, saying, really, it's worth a little bit extra labor cost and food cost to waste less and to feed more through offer versus serve. And the USDA actually enshrines it in their own regulations. So I can answer a lot of your questions today and engage in talks from, like, if you have a school, like you have some questions about schools, but already you see on USDA's handout that 31% of overall food supply went uneaten. Jonathan Bloom, who I think we remember from the panel talk, if you haven't read Jonathan Bloom's a book. It's called American Wasteland. Please do. He would actually put that number at about 40%. So that's a great book, opens your eyes, and he has done a few things in schools that you can relate to. So I'll stop there and let other panelists go.
The great thing about being on a panel is I get to learn stuff too. So I have a kindergartner, and he is allowed to buy lunch at school 1 or 2 days a week. And there are 3 choices down the road at the Glencairn Elementary School. And I've always wondered, like, are they producing a lot more food for the kids than they need? So I feel good learning something. The more you know, right? I have a few slides. I don't think I need to show them. If anyone has questions about our data, come email me. I'd be happy to share it. I guess I will just start by saying I am trained as a marine biologist. So not what you'd expect sitting on this panel. But then I worked in politics for a while in DC and spent a good amount of time at University of Texas at Austin working on energy and water. So I came to Michigan State, I got involved in this food initiative, Food at MSU, and what's amazing to me is that by talking about food issues, and in particular food waste, I'm still talking about climate, energy, water, limited resources, more people, how we're going to be able to make sense of this mess we've made on the planet. And so talk more about that, but more generally, I'll tell you a little bit about our work and what we've been doing here at Michigan State. So one of the projects, one of the centerpieces of Food at MSU is this food literacy and engagement poll. And every 6 months, we survey over 2,000 Americans age 18 and over, and we ask them questions about their attitudes related to food. And all this data is weighted to reflect US Census demographics. So it's a pretty accurate representation of the US as a whole. And it gives us a sense of where people are on their food literacy. And that's important because it's those public attitudes that trickle up into the policies we get and into the practical implications of how we make sense of the situation. And we've asked questions about everything from genetically modified foods to food labels. The results are often very surprising and start a conversation. For example, a couple years ago, we found that more than a third of Americans, 37%, did not even know that all food contains genes. And I suspect here in this room, people, for the most part, probably do know that, but we're not really representative of where Americans are as a country. So this year, just last month, I can still say that because it's still February.
That's right.
Last month, we took a closer look at food waste because this is an issue that's really important to us at the Food at MSU initiative. And we're doing that because, as you've been hearing, food waste accounts for over a third of food produced around the world for human consumption. Costs in the US $218 billion a year, or $1,800 per year for a household of 4, and produces a ton of greenhouse gas emissions. So if food waste were a nation, it would rank 3rd in emissions behind the US and China. So it's a pretty big deal. And something to be thinking about. And the results of our survey are actually pretty encouraging. So we found that 88% of Americans, wait, if I get that right, 88%, I should look at this. 88% of Americans say they're trying to reduce their food wasted at home. And for anyone who follows polling a bit, that's actually really, really high. Self-reported behavior isn't necessarily accurate all the time, but as a comparison, I can tell you that the National Science Foundation reported just a couple years ago that 76% of Americans knew that the Earth revolved around the sun. So 88% in polling is very high. At least that tells us people are maybe paying attention to this issue. Among that group, 71% say they try not to purchase excess food, 71% try to consume food before it spoils, 34%, which I'm part of, I guess, are really like pushing our excess food on other people to eat before it actually spoils. In my own house, you'd think my husband and I would be fairly good at reducing our food waste, and we do think about it. We have these like tiny little people that live with us who undermine us all the time by flinging food across the room, and we do our best. I can say my dog eats a lot of it, but she just gets fat, so I don't know if that's like a net positive or negative or what. We can also look at the data by different demographic information, and there are some pretty big differences in terms of age. So we actually found 94% of those 55 and older are paying attention to food waste at home and trying to reduce what they produce, reduce what they waste. While 81% of those under 30 said the same. When we ask them questions like why, we see things like not having enough time, We see people not understanding what the term food waste means, but on the whole, again, it's a positive story. We're also curious about attitudes related to the adoption of emerging technologies that can provide opportunities to tackle our food waste challenge. And we found that 41% of Americans say they're willing to buy a GMO-derived fruit or vegetable that would stay fresh longer than what's currently available. So that could be another way that new technologies might help us reduce what we waste. We also have just one food literacy question each wave. That's where we got that 37% didn't know all food contains genes. So this time we just simply asked how much food people think gets wasted. The latest percentage just reported by the USDA was 37% for the last year. So the correct range that we offered was 31 to 50%, and 40% of I know a lot of percents. 40% of people got that right. Younger Americans were more likely to get that right than seniors. Overall, those seniors do better on general food literacy questions, which is quite interesting. They're also more likely to get questions about genes and genetics and GMOs correct, even though that's counter to what I would have expected, because younger Americans would be more likely to have more recently been in school and be hearing about newer technologies. Anyway, I am throwing a lot of numbers at you, and I realize that, and it's a rich data set, and I haven't even begun to scratch the surface on a lot of different things like income and level of education and region, and just we have so much more data. So I will end by saying the message is an optimistic one. We are generally aware of our food waste challenge, and we seem to be taking steps across the country to reduce our, quote, I love this term, food print.
I will need my stills, the PowerPoint, if you don't mind. I think yeah, it's a lot easier for me because I'm not. Thank you. First of all, thank you for inviting me. Let me sort of quickly say what so I'm not an expert in food waste. I just have to confess a little bit. I like to study supply chains, and my association with food waste was when so I was a Broad Integrative Fellow, and we had a chance to go to a very large headquarters of one of the largest hotel chains in the country. And we sort of got this assignment of writing a teaching case about food waste. So it was a 1 week long immersion in front of town. And I think that it sort of gives you some high level perspectives on what is possible. But so I had a chance of participating in the food roundtable that Sheril had organized a few months ago. And from then, sort of my curiosity has been a little bit more. So I'm going to share a slightly different perspective from what our panelists have really talked about, right? So I picked up some statistics on magnitude, not just in the US, but global. It's almost like, from what at least BCG, a consulting company, predicts is about 1.6 billion to 2.1 billion tons worldwide. And US is certainly one of the largest. So in terms of dollars, it's almost more than $1 trillion of waste. It's not small amount, and I think 8% of the global greenhouse gases, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about where that is really coming from. And then 800, but when you see that against the idea that there are 870 million people in the world that are undernourished, that's a huge opportunity. And I think and I don't know if you heard this talk by Tristram Stewart in TED. He has this really cool talk where he equates food waste to 9 biscuits. And so I thought that I'll just really borrow from that. So if the total food in the world has 9 biscuits, right? So the first biscuit, so basically he sort of says that 4 of them are wasted because the first one is wasted due to farm loss, right? And then the other 2 biscuits, actually 3 biscuits, are on animal feed, meat, and poultry. And he says, okay, we get a little bit charitable and get 1 back, okay, because animals do provide us stuff, but they don't provide us all of those back. So we still lose 2, okay? And then what is 2 of those biscuits go to garbage dump, okay? And what is really left is 4 out of the 9. It's quite stunning, actually. You think about what is produced and what we are sort of wasting, right? So I sort of did some more work. I mean, USDA has done a ton of work on this, and I'm going to draw a lot on what they have done. If you think about factors, there are a lot. It's a very complex problem. I think it's not a simple problem, right? So Habits of individuals, of course, we've heard that. There are temporal and spatial settings too. I mean, it's a geography department, so I think we can talk about those, and I'll have some pointers on that. And then, of course, there are recovery efforts, and perishability is one of the biggest problems. If you take supply chain, I think it's easy to say we need to sort of understand the demand, but food is a very shelf life is a big issue, right? And of course, you take waste. There's waste at every level. I mean, we've talked about consumer, retail is a huge waste, farm to retail is a huge waste, and at the farm level there's waste, right? So the thing is, if you take what is really wasted, what feels bad here is not the non-perishable commodities. You take sugar, fat and oil, I would sort of probably say non-perishable to some extent, right? But look at grain products, fruit, vegetables, dairy products, meat and poultry. They are really fresh food. I mean, high nutrition value, high value in general. They are the ones that actually get wasted the most. We have kids across the country where we talk about fast food and this challenge between fast food versus fresh food, but it's really fresh food that bears the brunt just in terms of pure dollar value. Right? But we think about supply chain, which is sort of my domain. It happens across the entire value chain, starting from production, handling and storage, processing and packing, distribution, retail, consumption. It's quite complex. And we've tried to study this for years, but data is really, really hard to come by. Largely because of regulations and everything else, companies are not willing to share the data. So we have to rely a lot on these tertiary data sets. But there's also a different phenomenon that's happening with food nowadays. And I sort of want to point out. So this is a fruit supply chain that Rabobank put together. Okay, and you can see it's not restricted to a single region at all. So it's it's fundamentally global. So one of the big things that I think that many companies probably struggle with today is that we are living in an on-demand food culture, right? I mean, you had a great example when you started, right? But we have a global supply chain. So not all fruits, vegetables are now produced in the same country where they are consumed. So even here, I think when I go to Meyer, I actually see Chiquita bananas come from Mexico. Something to be said. And what's interesting is even vegetable supply chain is as global. So you can see how much global trade that's happening just on fruits and vegetables and food in general. So that's something to be thinking about. US imports a lot of meat from China. So that's also another, supply chain related angle. So a lot of these contribute to, so when we have to sort of plan at such massive scale, these are sort of things that we sort of need to think about, right? So, and of course, I'm not going to go through the food hierarchy, but what I really wanted to say was it's all about source reduction. When we talk about demand, supply, how can we actually get to source reduction and reduce? That's the key. Different solution approaches, technology, policy, and behavior, right? Just to give you one quick data point. So take apples, right? So if you take the global supply chain of food and you want to make it local, you can reduce travel time of apples from 1,555 miles on average to 77 miles. So it says something about carbon emissions and everything you're seeing. And this is true for all the food that we see. So there is something to be said about how is food sourced and consumed, who is producing them. And from a supply chain production angle, there is this issue of scale. We now believe in producing food on scale. It's a fundamentally different scale at which you're making and consuming food, right? And I think I'm going to skip all this. There are a bunch of different, potential solutions that I sort of picked up, and I'm going to stop here and maybe we'll come back as we have a lot of time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we open the discussion to the audience. Any questions, contributions?
Maybe it was Amanda, right?
Yeah.
A slightly technical question. Do you know, and I'm not an expert at all, can you use food waste for like biogas production or ethanol stuff? And if so, is that an efficient way to produce biogas? Or is it kind of like one of those complicated, you have to sort stuff out, you can only use certain foods, or could you just like pump it all in and then get a different product out of it?
Yeah. So it depends. It depends on how they built So they can produce it through anaerobic digestion, and it depends on how they build the tanks. So you can build tanks in different ways to do the anaerobic digestion. But I know the anaerobic digesters that my company had built, they accepted food waste and yard waste. So that was somewhat mixed. However, you have to be very careful with the sorting because you don't want to get any plastic in there because it could, destroy the batch. So there is a lot of sorting that goes into it. But it does produce, so the two main byproducts are a fertilizer that you can use to apply to fields, and then also the biogas. So methane, which you can convert for electricity or to power vehicles. A downside is that it also produces carbon dioxide. So, yeah.
Did you have any insight on like whether that's economically viable? Because it seems like you need a lot of pre-processing to get the nice side products out of it.
Yeah, because they sort of separate at the business level. So it's already been separated by the business, and then it gets sorted. And in California, they sort all the trash anyways. So adding another step. Yeah.
And you can go visit the anaerobic digester on campus here. It's just over by the MSU surplus store. It's in that area, and they could show you around and see a giant thing to walk through.
So when we think about how to have personal sustainability, do you think food waste is a good place to start, or water? I mean, this is a food panel, so I guess that's probably not the answer. But on a more individual basis, if you're trying to make an impact on the environment, which is the best place to start?
Well, I'll always talk, so.
All right, you go. I'll go.
I would just say, I think all of these things go hand in hand. I think that obviously there's the big piece that, corporate responsibility plays, and that has a great impact, but all of us on a personal level can do something. Thinking consciously when you're in your own home about reducing your food waste, and there's lots of ways to do that. I mentioned some before. Just Jonathan Blue would actually talk about more thoughtfully going to the market with a list and knowing what you need rather than impulse picking things off the shelves. Going through your refrigerator once a week and looking at what's still in the back, what you haven't eaten. Decisions like that, they do add up, and they do trickle out in other ways. And then especially your behavior might start to be mirrored by the people that you interact with. So I think that's really important, but saving food is also saving water. It is also saving energy. And of course, there are other individual decisions you can be making at home that would also have an impact as well. And then more broadly, where you're talking before about, I guess, the source of food, thinking about where it's coming from. There's actually some new data not yet released on meal kits, which on the surface seem like they're not very sustainable, seem very wasteful. But in the research that will be published shortly, I've gotten kind of a sneak peek at it, and it actually might not be as wasteful as we think, because it's saving a lot of energy potentially if trucks are delivering the food and people are recycling the materials. And that's a whole other conversation. But again, I can just go on. But I would just say I think we all have a role to play in each of these spaces.
From my perspective, you're talking to a career educator, former middle school teacher. So for me, it's never too young to teach a child good habits. I'll give you an example. One thing that I'm kind of excited to see is currently we have an expansion of our school breakfast program in Michigan. Not every school offers school breakfast, but we're trying to get schools interested not only to offer it at all, but also to offer it in the classroom at different times so that there's better consumption of breakfast and students are ready to learn. But along with this, I've done a little bit of interviews with principals who are seeing some positive effects already from our expansion efforts the last few months. And one of the principals relayed to me, well, we also use it as responsibility time. I said, what do you mean responsibility times? Well, this is a great, we have breakfast in the classroom. They have like a sort of a 15-minute period where they talk to their teachers, stuff like that. It's, kind of getting the child oriented to the school day kind of thing too. But we make sure to engage the children in the cleanup habits as well as making sure they're taking just what they need for the day. That's pretty cool. So that's one small example of many opportunities that schools can lead, where you can teach good habits and resourcefulness and responsibility over what you take.
Yeah. So kind of going off of your point, I think it wasn't mentioned, but retailers are usually 10% of that 30% waste, and then consumers are actually 20%. So actually consumers are usually the ones who are wasting double the amount as retailers. So going off of that, going back to the source reduction, do you think that it's the fault of the producers that they're just producing way too much food and then pushing it on consumers, or consumers don't know how to handle the food and so they're wasting a lot?
I think it's sort of both ways. So for example, I'm not going to say it's the fault of the consumers or the producers. I mean, you sort of look at a phenomenon in general, right? Because I don't want to assign blame to people rather than. So for example, one of the things I sort of feel is that the food environment in which we are in today, like in the last 30, 40 years, it's incredible amount of variety. You just have to go walk into Namanya to see how much stuff is there. And what we tend to do is, and of course our taste buds are very developed too, right? So I think that we tend to pick all these varieties, and to me, that's where it starts, because companies are seeing that, right? They see that as data points. They're trying to serve their consumers, not hold back. So as they see more and more, and they want to sort of tap into your experiences more, they try to offer you that variety. But I think what happens is in the process of production of this variety, it sort of comes back, and you have to expand your product line. You have to expand your portfolio. Take cereal bars. I'm just going to give you one simple example. The variety of cereal bars that you will see in a typical retail store is just incredible. Take milk, for example, starting from non-fat milk all the way to whole milk. How many types of milk you find? I think all of these contribute. And I don't think there is one factor there. It's sort of mutually reinforcing. Yes, you can reduce the amount of waste at home. Like in our house, so our kindergartners went to the same daycare. So we have this basic rule that she just cannot get out of her dinner table if there is something in her plate. And for the last 6 months, she hasn't wasted maybe one day. But I think that it's sort of strictly imposed, right? So, but even then, you look at a refrigerator, we have a ton of unused food. Now, to me, companies are seeing that, right? Companies are thinking, I bought stuff and they are producing because I bought some stuff. But they don't know it's lying in my fridge for the next 4 months and I'm not using it. And how many of us are actually engaging in such behaviors? So I think the behavior is not just in terms of buying and eating, but there's a lot more to it. We have a very classic phenomenon in supply chain called the bullwhip effect. So what we basically say is that, I'll give you a very simple example. Toilet paper rolls. Usually you go to Meijer, you get toilet paper rolls in 6 packs or sometimes 12 packs. You go to Costco, it's even worse, right? So, but the thing is that, but we don't end up using those toilet paper rolls for 3, 4, 5 months. But when those rolls are sold, what at wholesaler level, at factory level, they say is even larger and larger consumption. So they try to prepare for that. So it's complex. There's no straight answer to that.
Yeah, I would add to that too. I mean, I'm immediately thinking of things like subsidies, which are encouraging us to produce more of a certain staple that we probably don't need, and then we put it into things that maybe we don't need to put it into because we have so much of it. So there's a lot of problems that there are policy levers that we could use to do better. In addition, I think it's worth pointing out that if you're talking about, say, first developing countries, the point of the most food waste changes. So in developing countries, we see a lot more food waste from farm getting it to the market. In places like the US, things are a lot tighter. We waste a lot less. We have the means to keep more of the pests out of the grains, things like that. So then we do waste it in a giant amount once we get home. But there are things that are changing, new technologies, again, not just like the potential for this GMO-derived fruit or vegetable, but something I immediately think of is we are now developing packages that, because the sell by dates, use by dates, best by dates, a lot of that is completely arbitrary, as you guys probably know. Rather than count on these dates, which are largely influenced by consumer demand, to have them on the product, and I mean, that goes to all sorts of crazy food labels, totally other topic. There are new technologies that are not here now, but that we expect to see soon in the marketplace, where the bags would actually change color depending on what's happening inside. And so little things like that can tell us a lot more visually very quickly about whether that food is still okay to eat. And then we'd see things last longer. But we also have to change our own attitudes, because like, there are markets that I won't name that will throw out just tremendous amounts of food even before the sell-by date, just because they don't want it on their shelves. They think it turns people off. So that's a cultural change that we really should be, putting pressure on these places to change.
And I think also kind of going off of those points, like thinking about it as a consumer side, so like us as individuals, I think doing a better job at planning our meals for the week. So, rather than just kind of going to the grocery store and thinking, oh, maybe I'll make this, maybe I'll have this week. Trying to plan your meals. So what are you gonna eat for breakfast, lunch, dinner, and then you don't have your grocery list that way. Try to help you with it.
Yeah, from the K-12 schools perspective, we work with food service directors to train them how to properly plan their menus. They plan their menus based on their buying. There actually is a pretty tight, training system we have. We see a lot of really good professional habits between matching what the school, the kids want and what they'll eat. We encourage them to look at their data and have a continuous improvement process on their own systems, which then flows into their ordering from the USDA websites, from their other, the commercial sources. They're also able to get commercial foods. But what we see still a lot of is overservice. So overservice is, well, we planned for 300 kids, we got 280, 20 kids worth of food has to either be eaten by adults, then they get charged a meal price too. They can't just automatically get the food because these are USDA purchased foods, or it's just straight wasted. Overservice is happening in this room right now, right? Because if I told you that you couldn't leave the room until everybody had one more bagel, and pairs of you had to finish up those yummy yogurts, you'd revolt. I can't make you do that. But you planned for a certain amount of people. About a third of those people really used up what you planned for, so that's an example of overservice. And overservice actually surrounds us. We don't even think of it. We are so abundant that it doesn't hit our brains. Great example of this is, and I like that you opened up with your own personal story coming from Africa, and then when you got here, your attitude was jolted, going, well, there's all this food, what are we doing? You're probably thinking, what happens to that food? Where does that go? About 3 years ago, my wife helped with she was actually an assistant on a study trip to Cameroon, and that jolted her the other way because there were many days where she literally didn't know where dinner was going to come from, or if at all, and that was the one time she was eating. And even the people running the tour for all the Americans were like, yeah, we're going to be going to a village. We think they'll serve us food. We're going to hope, we're going to ask nicely, but they may not have enough. And, that was a really interesting jolt. So overservice here in America especially is just all around us in a pervasive way.
I have 2 questions for the panel. One is regarding high-income countries and the price of food. Is that something that, because it's too cheap, we're wasting so much, or related to our income? And the second one is, will collection of organic at the home will help on reducing the amount of waste that we're creating? Because right now I go to landfill, and I know that the landfills are happy because it produces more methane. But if we have a collection system for organics, will that help the consumer realize how much of the waste that they're generating is actually being collected separately from the recycling and the landfill?
The first was price of food.
Price of food is cheap for that high income countries. Collection of organic at the home level.
Well, to your first point, the pricing question is really complicated because despite being a wealthy country and lots of people with lots of food, there's lots of people who are food insecure. I think it's what 1 out of 5 kids in Michigan.
100%.
So pricing gets a lot more complicated because we want to make sure that everyone, and particularly children, have enough to eat. And so I think that's really tricky to figure out. But of course, because a lot of food is so cheap, and often those aren't the healthiest foods that are so cheap. Fast foods are cheap, then that creates other healthcare problems as well, like promoting obesity among people who are coming from the most food insecure places, and all sorts of other health problems associated with that as well. So that wasn't really an answer, but.
I agree. I think pricing issue certainly is very complex, right? So I think the thing that I think about is that pricing should be seen in the light of perishability, right? So food that has low perishability typically are not healthy, right? So you take hotels, large hotel chains, or industry produced, like mass produced bagel shops. They are not super healthy. I mean, they were preserved for a long enough time, but they can serve them, but it's not work out well. The challenge I find is that if there is the biggest insecurity in food everywhere, even in countries like, let's say, India, as a benchmark, right? I think that the country benchmarks on standard prices of potatoes, onions, and all the basic vegetables that you are expected to have on your palate on a day-to-day basis, rice. But here, I think the benchmark is a little bit different. That's why I think it starts making a difference as to what your palate is. So price is completely driven by palate. You can modify that. Yeah, I don't think price should be a factor because food is the one thing that has to be for all, irrespective of what the background of people are. So the second part where you talk about collection of organic food at sort of home and local level, there are lots of places which are now believing in collecting this food and maybe finding other uses for it. Can continue doing that. And the challenge there is how do you segregate, how do you make sure that you can extract the energy value from whatever is left? I guess, what do you do with all that? I don't know. Right, and I think that how much do you spend to collect and fix that problem, as opposed to figuring out how do you reduce and make food move less. So that's sort of, yeah, both of them are very complex problems. I don't know how else to say much. So I would probably say more than source reduction, price, and I don't know what the research here is, but I think probably not. So when we think about food scale, going back to your issue of price, I think the bottom line here is we sort of live in an on-demand food culture. I want to eat the food that I want to eat, when I want to eat, where I want to eat, with no limitations. That's sort of the world I think we live in. And the question I would sort of ask is that the right way to think about this? I don't know.
Yeah, so I mean, it seems like you have these kind of opposing goals with, at least with overfeeding versus providing low price. So if you have a really low price, if food is really cheap, then it's easy to overfeed. It makes sense to oversupply or over provision, right? So you keep figuring out ways to get really cheap food, then you're always going to have too much food and you're going to have more food on demand. How do you guys feel about sort of balancing these issues?
Okay, well, I think that's a really good question, but there are layers to it, right? So it was a big report released, I don't know, a month ago or so, called the Eat Lancet report, that was focused on sustainability and health generally, and it included dozens of experts in nutrition and sustainability globally to make recommendations on specifically meat consumption and overall diet, looking at numbers. Now, in this country, we eat a ton of red meat. That report was thinking more broadly about, what's the impact of producing X many cows, and do we need to be doing that? And how do we do that in light of different cultural differences around the world, right? Or folks that haven't traditionally had access to red meat and other meats, and their increased interest in it complemented, or at the same time, dealing with, you know, the problem in the US where maybe we're producing so much because it is so cheap, that we're also eating ourselves into some health issues associated with those kinds of habits. So I mean, all this to say, I think that the pricing piece is part of the problem, but the incentives that are creating that problem are bigger than the actual just like economics of it. And there are some people pushing in other directions to say what we should do, but it's hard to tell, for example, Americans, that they should consume less red meat when like half of my girlfriends think they're on the keto diet, which by the way is not a good idea. But there are a lot of like popular cultural trends that sort of feed into this as well, which make it really, really hard to find a solution. But I think we are headed in some good directions now, at least as far as recommendations. We'll see how they are applied in the real world.
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer from a K-12 school's perspective because schools kind of get a free pass from the whole question because their pricing structures and their purchasing power is actually entirely restricted. It's almost like a secondary market with its own rules. And also, I would also add there's something that's not on the handouts that I brought. Michigan has 3 purchasing consortia. So schools, to get their USD commodity foods, they actually go through, and also their vended foods, they actually go through these purchasing consortia that help redistribute. They actually help aggregate orders, and then you have less waste in that process. But you also control the pricing too. So it's interesting because we also have a structure that defrays the costs to the student. So a lot of students are free lunch students. Some are reduced price. The reduced price is like 35 cents or 40 cents. Imagine getting your lunch for 35 cents or 40 cents every day. But imagine also, not only do you have that, right, but even paid students can be charged only a certain maximum. And you can't adjust for heavy swings in your food costs because the USDA restricts your ability to increase the price of your lunch by a certain calculation. So it's so heavily restricted that it actually becomes an artificiality, right? But even within that, right, you actually see some interesting trends. So for example, one of the things that we're trying to work out right now, which is not easy at all, is what to do with negative fund balances. So negative fund balance is a fun way of saying that the kid doesn't have any more money in their school food account and they can't get lunch. You know, you've seen some of the media about it. You know, the kid will get lunch shamed, right? Or they'll get the cold lunch or whatever. Or you heard I'm sure you heard of you might have heard of the media stories of where the kid goes through the line and the food is thrown away in front of the kid because they don't have enough money. Thankfully, it has to happen in Michigan. We train our people not to do that. But still, a kid's got to get fed. So what do you do with that? And what happens is we have some districts that have tens of thousands of dollars of financial liability, and they have to take from their general fund to zero out the school food account because that's a nonprofit. That's under law. So we have this really interesting like artificial bubble, right, of pricing and what you get for, and also value. I mean, if I remember as a teacher, as an adult meal, it only cost me $3. I'm like, why would I go anywhere else? I'm going to eat at school every day. And I get $3 of a tray full of spaghetti. I'm like, yes, this is awesome. Built this body on spaghetti. It's $3 will buy you a lot. You know, but is that what I wanted? And was that a good value anyway? And so it's very, that whole question of pricing and what you get in the value is very different for schools.
So don't quote me on this, but I'm pretty sure that in the US we spend about 10% of our income on food, whereas people in Europe spend 20-30% of their income on food. So going back to the idea of pricing, I mean, should there be like a higher tax on foods that aren't good for you? Like I know there's been a soda tax implemented in some states.
Can I just interject?
Yeah.
I'm from Germany, and food is way cheaper back there than here.
Or do you eat better foods in Germany? Because I remember being in Germany and having a great time.
No, but I think also percentage-wise, we're actually one of the countries spending the least amount. That's not true for all of Europe, but at least Germany, I would take out of that statement.
Right.
Yes.
But yeah, so do you think that putting taxes on foods that aren't good for you is a good idea, I guess?
Well, Americans really like freedom. Like, they like to talk about how they like their freedom. And whenever someone in a position of power tries to tell people what they can and cannot do, it usually backfires politically. So I just don't think it's viable from the policy perspective of maintaining your office to introduce something like that.
It's not directly related, but I'm from Kenya, and looking at how the discussion is going, I try to relate to pricing and the quality of food. Back there, poor quality food costs more than healthy food. So you really have to pay more money to be able to eat junk food compared to, if you are not very rich or wealthy, then you're more likely to eat vegetables and all these good quality food. So I don't know how those dynamics play out.
Yeah, your question might have more to do with food quality. So if you are looking at a statistic that's showing that in a certain place people are spending more food, it could be that they're more mindful of the quality of food they want, they're willing to spend more for it. And Americans, it's true, is generally not. We just want the quick, if you go to Wendy's or wherever, it's 4 things for $4, and I'm like, I got 20 minutes to do this. We do, and going back to something I said earlier about forming habits in children early too, what we're hoping to do, there's actually a couple of exciting programs that we have also that are USDA regulated, but it's also backed up by our state legislature who see a lot of wisdom in reinvesting in Michigan farms and doing locally sourced stuff. So one thing I have in mind is our what's called our 10 cents a meal program, which is actually it's actually a grant to match the spending that schools normally do on locally sourced fruits and vegetables. The state legislature will give you as much money as you spend. They'll match your funds to get more vegetables and fruits in. And that's the way a lot of our food service directors power their salad bars. So like salad bars in school sounds great. Some of this stuff, guys, is awesome. Like you go into some of these high schools too. I'd rather eat there. In some of my other places, I'm like, can I have a salad? They're great stuff. Not every school does it though, because one factor that we face is this, that there's a lot of disproportionality, a lot of variance among our schools and districts and their leadership and what they want. But we're hoping on having more programs like that, so if they're going to have the money, if you're going to spend the money, spend it on good stuff, right? Spend it on the fresh fruits and vegetables.
I think a big issue too is that human tastes are so malleable. So as I said, my background's all in marine biology and fisheries. And like anyone who spent a lot of time on the water with fishermen hears the stories about how lobsters were considered the poorest man's meal for a very long time before consumers drove those prices way up. We've seen the same thing happen more recently with skate. So skate used to be something that got stuck in nets and nobody wanted. Now you go to New York City, it's like $35 for a piece of skate. Capitalism, we drive a lot of these trends. My graduate work was all on the very charismatic sea cucumber. And the only reason I was doing a lot of population modeling and reproductive work because it was a species in the Gulf of Maine that everybody ignored. Fishermen hated them because they'd clog up their dredge nets when they were getting urchins. And all of a sudden, traditionally harvested sea cucumbers in other parts of the world were endangered and disappearing. So they looked to this much less delicious species in the Gulf of Maine because they knew there was a market for it. So there was no protections for them. Like a handful of fishermen were going in, getting them as fast as they could unsustainably, and they were freeze dried and shipped to the Far East, where people thought they were an aphrodisiac, and they're totally not. But the point is that, you know, we create prices, and prices are artificially raised based on demand. So
that's very true. I think that going back to your example, it's quite intriguing. In Kenya, you said that, you know, locally sourced food, that's mostly natural food, you know. So going the earlier point about, you know, how do you, it's a lot easier to balance out what gets produced and what gets consumed in a smaller territory, at least as far as food is concerned. Right? So I think because, you know, it's sort of an everyday production, everyday consumption, but you would also see that in those territories, the variety of food they eat is not a whole lot. You know, so it's sort of very easy to predict, understand what is needed, set up the basic infrastructure. But I think in the American context, I think the variety of food we eat is quite humongous. And on the pricing factor, I think that, you know, if you take fresh food like organic, non-GMO type food, it is expensive even in the US. I don't think it is cheap. So this 10%, I've always thought, where is this benchmark coming from? And it's we probably need to consider all the other variables around this to see how it sort of fits together. Because in other countries, I don't think, at least maybe I'm sure in India, it's going up steadily. I don't have research numbers on this. It's just my own observation, is that the consumption of off-the-shelf food that's been hanging around for a long time, cereal bars, things, it's still not very high. You know, so people don't do that a whole lot like we do here. So that's something to think of too.
So you talked about a little bit about the impact of meal kits, but has the kind of increase toward the local food movement, has that had any impacts on food waste?
that's a great question. It's, again, like complicated and not easy to get around. So a lot of people think that local is always better. The truth is, from a sustainability perspective, it's not necessarily, right? Because if you're trying to grow hothouse tomatoes, or you're trying to raise goats, or do something in a climate that isn't suited to that, then you're producing a lot of heat and doing a lot of other things in ways that are creating more emissions and a lot less sustainable over time. So I'm all for local foods. We have a giant garden in my backyard, and we grow what we can. But I think, unfortunately, and we definitely see this in our polling, people are willing to pay a lot more for things that they think are better. So like we've seen explosions of the different logos on labels, right? Like the non-GMO label that does tell you something. And you know, organic farming can be great for the environment for certain reasons. But now we're seeing non-GMO water, and water shouldn't have genes in it. They're just charging $3 more for a box of water because you feel better about buying it. And we're seeing that with all sorts of things, like the big gluten-free movement. Most people don't need to eat gluten-free foods. I mean, there's so many of them. And so I think, you know, source of production is really important, but, you know, a big part of that is what should be grown or, you know, produced in that region based on like the climate and the environment. So I don't think it's maybe, I guess, short version, I don't think it's maybe more conscious or necessarily better actors, but maybe made a lot of people feel like they are.
Can I just jump in on that one? So, but how do you know when you reach that line where importing is more sustainably in like the overall picture than not? Because back home we get a lot of stuff from the Netherlands where everything's from greenhouses basically. And it's like, at what point is that better than, or importing from bananas from South America and trying to do that by myself or in like neighborhood? Like that's what I feel is the problem, right? You don't know the whole life cycle of it all.
Exactly.
As a consumer, and I don't think like there are experts that might know it about one food, but not about everything.
So there are people, I'm thinking,
like a rule of thumb.
Well, Michael Weber from UT Austin, he's my colleague, he and I were just on the panel. So he's the one who's done a ton of calculations on looking at energy costs of food transportation. I mean, if you think of all the energy that goes into produce food, energy and water, it's like you know, tilling the land, like planting, harvesting, refrigerating, packaging, like all of these steps along the way add up. So very conservatively, I used to be there. So our group calculated that at least 3% of the entire energy budget for the United States goes into food we throw away. And I can promise you it's higher if we were just very, very conservative. For the average consumer, it's near impossible. And we used to be a society where many people were deeply, inherently connected to the farms. Less than 2% of us today live on farms or work on farms. And I think we're completely dissociated from the food that sustains us. And that is why people who are big influencers, I'm thinking of Kardashians and Gwyneth Paltrow, and like those people come out with these ridiculous things about how we should eat. And that's who we're turning to for answers. When there are some of those experts on places like college campuses and elsewhere who are doing those calculations. There's definitely some good work by USDA, but I think for the rest of us, it's hard to make sense of it. The general rule of thumb for me is I try to just like intuitively look at what I'm buying and think, did that come from here, and should it come from here? You shouldn't be like raising certain species in Michigan that probably are native to Mexico.
Because, sorry to keep going on this, but is aquaponics becoming a thing here? Because it's kind of, they just built a pretty big one in like northeastern Germany where they're growing tomatoes. So I'm just then thinking, well, they are doing all this like using fish waste to fertilize the ground for tomatoes, and waste from tomatoes goes back to feed fish, blah, blah, blah. So it seems very sustainable, but you need energy. Would this tomato be better than getting an imported one from Italy? It's just so complicated that I wonder whether consumers can actually make a sustainable choice in this regard.
I don't think there's an easy answer. I mean, I'm just thinking like more than hydroponic, but like all the urban farming we see in cities that's popping up, in warehouses that are growing plants, and they're primarily like herbs and things like that. They can't grow giant corn, like bundles of corn, I guess, vertically. So in some regard, that there's arguments to be made that can be sustainably done at large scale. But then at the same time, energy from the sun is free. You've got to create all that light inside a warehouse. So what's the trade-off? I don't know the answer. I think it's a really important question to be asking them.
Yeah, I think it is a very interesting point. I want to go back to one. This is probably not a scientific answer. I don't think this is probably scientific at all. So I will acknowledge it up front. I think either eat to live or live to eat. Right? So I think that we sort of are when we sort of adopt a philosophy that we live to eat, then we don't respect the seasonality of certain foods. So today, when I was young, I remember. There were certain foods that were not available in the season. We knew it was off season. So yeah, it'll be okay, when the season shows up, we are going to eat and be happy about it. But today, and today, you go to Meyer through the year, you just want to see strawberry every time in that aisle. And we don't see when that strawberry is produced, when it is consumed. Because as a consumer, our mindset, like I said, it's on-demand mindset. I want to eat what I want to eat when I want to eat. And that to me is troublesome. I don't know if there's a fix to it. And if you want to reduce food waste, to me, that would sort of probably go a very long way in, so would I, if I look at my own purchase patterns and behavior in the last couple of years, I probably don't know what is seasonality anymore, because everything is in deep freeze. Stored in massive quantities in some place, and when I want it, they'll just show up at the store. That's precisely what I'm saying. So that's what encourages global trade of food. So going back to your question, to me, that's what encourages global trade of food. Yeah, in South America, it's sort of fundamentally different approach to food. So I'm going to buy whatever I want to buy from there. But if you're buying in massive quantities, putting in food on large containers, whether it's cold storage or whatever it is, you are going to have waste. It's not possible to eliminate that waste.
For sure, I really appreciate what you do with the kids, because you train a kid and then you just be responsible people in the future. But I go back to dining halls. I mean, at times I feel when I go to serve and I have a bigger spoon, I'm supposed to fill it. I scoop, put on my plate. I can do half, I can do it, I have to fill it.
Sure.
And I was thinking of if we introduce smaller spoons so that maybe someone gets tired.
Right.
So what do you think would be like a practical solution to what we are saying in a dining hall? It's crazy what you see in those dining halls.
Yeah, so my first thought as you were asking questions, portion sizing and getting students to understand what a proper portion is. I mean, our proportionality in this country is just way out of whack. I mean, think about what you expect even. Like you get mad, like I remember getting mad if like, hey, hey, I'm paying $5 for this, give me an extra helping. Like now I think to myself, this actually is 2 meals. Anybody from Africa or a less developed nation, for example, would look at what we have and go, I could have this for 3 days and I'd be all right, right? So I think getting kids to recognize, so one of the things as an educator I know really works well, we don't always do well, I'm just talking from an educational theory thing, is getting students to reflect on their own experience, getting students to reflect on their own thinking, right? So sort of, we call it metacognition, thinking about your thinking. So some of the behaviors when you want to develop a habit or behavior in a young learner or even an adult learner too, like we've all got habits we have to unlearn, right? But you have to make it conscious. You have to have it in their front, their front of their brain, then they can go ahead and restore it. But you have to come up and make a change. And so you have to make them aware of the things, have the discussion about the things, get them to pull out from them their own judgment about a thing, and then you can go ahead and reinforce the habit. So portion sizes are something where you can teach that already, and even pre-kindergartner kids can think about on their level. Did I have enough food? Is this really what I want? Am I actually hungry right now? So those are questions that we don't always ask ourselves. Again, you walked in, you had a bagel. I didn't think I was hungry now. It was just there, right? So I think that's a good thing to think about. And then the other thing I would answer to your question about how to get, again, that raises awareness in the mind of the child, mind of the student, is some of the things that we kind of tag as what we call smarter lunchroom strategies. And there's actually a mention of smarter lunchrooms movement on this handout. But this one here from the USDA talks a little bit about it. It's got about 17, 18 words to tell you all about it, which is not really justice. But the smarter lunchroom strategies has a set of research come out of Cornell University. It's one of these interesting things where the researcher has been debunked, but everyone loved it so much that they continue to endorse it. But there's nothing wrong with it either, because it gets students to be more attracted to the food, more attracted to the food line. But before they even get to the food line, they're thinking about what they want, what the choices are, why they should have those choices, and get something about what's healthy for them. It can have anything to do with signage, presentation, choice. It can also, smarter lunchroom strategies also focus on even the foot traffic pattern of where the child enters the food line, what the person sees first, second, third, fourth, how they check out, whatever, and where things, for example, the extra foods are located, we call them a la carte items. But even before the child gets there, the person should be aware, oh, I've had enough on my plate, right? So the food portioning thing I'm talking about kind of goes hand in hand with the smarter lunchroom strategies about how to shepherd the child's, not just the child's body, but the child's thinking through the act of being served food. So smaller, when you said like a smaller scoop, like, yeah, it's more of which I think you're really talking about portions, but the child who's really hungry too should be able to be de-identified. You shouldn't have to know if the child's hungry or not. That person should know if they need enough food. Some students depend on schools for almost all of their food, right? And so what you don't want to do is you don't want to put hungry kids in one line, less hungry kids in another line, because that might also be your free kids in one line and your paid kids in another line. You don't want to do that. You should be able to actually give that child the responsibility over their own decisions empower them to make them and allow them the empowerment and the strategies to be able to make those decisions.
And I think going back to just MSU's cafeterias here, they use trays, and so people can pile on as much food as they want. They can try everything that looks good. But just removing the trays, I know that UC Santa Barbara removed the trays in their dining hall, and they adjusted the portion sizes, and they reduced their food waste by 50%. Just doing that. So I think that's one practical solution. Kids can still go up and get as much as they want, but they just can't fit all on the tray.
I think you about that here.
They do that in Brody Hall, but they don't do it in all the dining halls. It just depends on which one you're in. But they did try that, and they do. I know they do it in some halls, and they were supposed to do it in all the halls, but I don't know what happened. But they didn't do that.
At least school translated, they don't. But I know. Right.
Yeah, adding to that for the practical solution. I heard a sushi restaurant in here in Lansing is just open, and they have a policy: it's all you can eat. And then when you get in, if something is left over, they raise and you have to pay for that. You know, at the end of your table, you have to pay for that. I think that's a really good solution. And people just eat as much as they want, you know, and they don't waste anything.
Yeah, and all you can eat buffets are a whole other, other issue. It's not specifically unique to the US, but it's a lot more pervasive here.
Oh, yeah.
And it's just, in my mind, absurd.
Actually, we did, so when we were talking to the hotel, one of the things we found was that, take, you know, if you go to a large, really fine dining restaurant, many of them have reasonably large portion sizes. And the reason they have large portion sizes is they're trying to justify the dollars they're charging you. Right, but you may not necessarily need those portion sizes. That's sort of a key part. You're saying, hey, I'm paying $20, but did you just give me so much to eat? You know, but that's sort of something that I think is sort of our cognitive. And then you know, you go to these buffets. The customers might take more food if they find the buffet is full. And you think it's good food if it's full. And so we have all these different little associations in our brains that we don't know when they fire how. Right?
Even the color of the plate. So we choose different amounts of food if we were using a dark plate versus a light colored plate.
That's right.
So some of you guys mentioned the food recovery hierarchy, and I was just wondering what makes composting less preferred compared to the options on there. It seems like composting.
I don't know that it's less preferred. Are you just kind of going from the top down?
Yeah, because on the side.
Yeah, I don't think what you're seeing there is preference. Oh yeah, it says on the prefer on the back. I don't know, when I read this, I don't know that preferred is the greatest word for the side. I'm going to say, this is why I say it. Thinking about, Sriram, what you said about supply chains, things like that, I almost see this as a de-supply chain. So you've been supplied, now what do you do with your extra, right? So when I see this is, let's go first, second, third, fourth. Stop here. If you can't do that, stop here. If you can't do that, stop here. I think what it's thinking, what it has you doing is thinking mindfully through the possible steps. And if you put them in order, then I think that's what, makes sense. I don't know, I can see why they say preferred too, because people are like, well, we'd rather not go landfill if we can. So if you go up the triangle, I can see preference. I still don't know if preferred is the right word. I just think it's more like before X, try Y, before Y, try Z, you go up like that. That's how I think of it. It's a good question, though. I would confuse, wouldn't it? Like preferred. I don't know if you have any, I don't think there's statistical survey data that says, maybe people prefer this. I don't think that's what it is. Would you agree with Sriram? I mean, I don't, here's what he was talking about.
Yeah, no.
Oh, you know.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I agree with you. I'm sure you have insights on this, given that you have done this a little bit before. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, no, I completely agree with what he said. The first thing you should do is try to reduce waste in the first place. The second you should do, if you have a surplus, donate it to people who need food. And then the third thing, I think, is feeding animals.
Mhm.
And then,
Yeah, animals, can't feed people, feed animals, can't do that,
Yeah.
feed the soil, right.
yeah, so that way you're down the line, you're
Yeah, you're
reducing
working on
food each way, or each step.
I think you had a question.
Yeah, it's not a question. Just I want to bring my concern about. So this is a very interesting discussion. But as an international student, considering in the States there are a lot of international citizens, I realized that the education program is very interesting, and I appreciate you guys are doing that. But regardless the education, if there is no, I think that if there is no the society and the lifestyle supporting the education, there is nothing. So I realized coming from Italy, where my education is don't waste everything.
Right.
Like it was saying, you have the food on your plate, you have to finish before leaving dinner. I realized coming here, I don't have time to do grocery during the week, so I have to wait for the weekend, buy a bunch of stuff, and put them in the refrigerator. I just forget, because I also don't have time to cook. I don't have time to, I cannot split my day in breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I'm totally messed up. So I think the lifestyle is the most important thing to consider after the education for the kids. I don't know if there is a supporting for this kind of stuff.
Well, I don't disagree. I mean, you're absolutely right, because if you put out citizens into a lifestyle, if you teach them something, then they're fully qualified to not participate because it's a different rule set. As soon as you put them out the door, yes, I don't disagree. I wonder, some of it's not a K-12 problem, some of it's a higher ed, some of it's beyond that. I think you're totally right that in an adult life, you try to use what you learn, but we kind of know from studies that your K-12 and your higher ed, if you have higher ed, prepare you for only about 30% of what you need to know as a person. What we're trying to focus on more, and I see some trends in education, but not fast enough. I wish they were faster, is to focus on the whole child and not just, what that means is not just think of a kindergartner as a future academician, right? Otherwise you're just doing the brain stuff, right? We talk about cognition all the time. Random examples, I got an invitation to a conference that's out east somewhere, and it's this education learning conference, and everything was brain, right? Everything was how to recognize a child prodigy, how to get your kid to think better, cognition in you, and all this stuff. I'm going, that's cool, the brain stuff. And I remember having that, in my teacher preparation courses. But then I thought to myself, where's some of the behavior stuff? Where's some of the nutrition stuff? Where's some of the social dimension stuff that we're not teaching? And we can't really teach some of that. We actually can, some of that stuff at schools is just opportunistic. You can only put the child into certain situations. But we've also removed the situations because we are kind of hyper-focused on the super high way toward college and career. Nothing wrong with preparing kids toward college and careers. Nothing wrong with that. But we miss things along the way because we are attuning our experience, right? Just to the brain and just to like what you can get done, and can you get more and more A's, and can you produce more? Can you achieve more? And can you take over and conquer? That's really what we are all about, which is sad. So I don't know if there's a solution to what you say. I just resonate with it as an educator with how kids are taught nowadays, right?
Okay, I have two concerns about some of the stuff you've been saying. So one thing is when you say, okay, we're going to teach our kids or anybody to not waste food by making them finish their plate. I feel like that might kind of directly lead into an eating problem.
I've had a couple of things too in my, I was like, I don't know what finishing.
Not necessarily, but you know, like I guess this whole like reflecting on your thinking like that when you're hungry is
right.
more useful, but also way harder. I mean, it's
Oh,
easy
yeah.
to say finish your plate and then we're done. It's easier. I just thought of that. I was like, I'm not sure, but I don't also know a better way to do it. So
No, yeah. No, when Sriram said that, I assumed that he'd already been teaching his kids take an appropriate portion and don't leave that.
So that's
Right.
that's
I
that's
said
the
that in
point.
for
I don't.
Right,
I
right.
don't.
No, no.
I think the point is that you got to eat healthy, right? I mean, you put the food in front of them that they have to eat. That's our choice, right? But at the same time, teaching them that you can't overeat all the time is also a sort of choice. And I think that, one thing I'm really surprised is that if you let kids' innate instincts take over, they don't overeat. They don't overdo most of the time.
That's right.
And I think what typically happens is that as time passes, they become numb to the idea of self-disciplining themselves around the notion of food because of all the behaviors we create. So maybe I should have said it slightly different. Right. And I think the not wasting has to become a self-discipline for them. It's not like you take a stick in front of them and stand saying, you're not going to do it. Right? So that's not what I intended to say. But yeah, you are right.
Just wanted to throw that out there. And my second point was to the packaging that changes colors when food goes bad. There's a massive movement right now back home to reduce packaging in general. So I'm just worried that if we just change the technology of our packaging to help reduce food waste, we're creating a different problem with more packaging, because at some point people will, if that happens, will only rely on packaging colors instead of their sense of smell and stuff. Coming back to the idea again that education might be better, but at the same time, will education actually stick in the long run?
Well, I think it's not an end-all solution. So, and those technologies, I mean, my understanding, and it's not my expertise, but my understanding is for the things like bagged lettuce, which some people, I think especially from a time perspective, go for the salad kits and things like that people are going to keep purchasing as a kit, making it less likely that they just wind up sitting on shelves or sitting in the back of our fridges till they look disgusting or get thrown out by these markets 2 days before the sell-by date when they've still got a week plus. So in a small way that, and I'll just add that I was having flashbacks when you were saying that. So my parents were totally you cannot leave the table. And I'd wait it out with them and have this brown banana that would slowly get grosser hours into the night. So,
Right, it was a new versus banana.
To be fair though, I think about my mom and her attitudes on food, and she was not food secure growing up. And her mom, she was first generation, and her mom grew up not even being able to live with her mother because there wasn't enough money and they couldn't feed her. So I think that a lot of my mom's perspectives on how we had food, because we always had tons of food in we didn't have a pantry because we had a really small place, but we had tons of food in our basement. And my friends who'd come over just thought it was so funny. And it wasn't perishable foods, it was cereal bars. But a big part of that was my grandmother couldn't drive. So when my grandfather got sick, they didn't have a way to get food. And so in many ways, my mother was stockpiling stuff because of that memory or that experience. And so I think we also have to take into account people's relationship with food culturally and what their experiences are before we tell people how to be purchasing and using the food that they have.
I'm just a little curious. How many of us have young kids at home? So how many of us think that they eat enough?
It depends on the
They eat
day.
enough on the day. Most of the time, oh, my kid doesn't eat enough. That's sort of our complaint, I guess. But that sort of reinforces the point that I was trying to make. Most of my friends, when we talk to them, they say, oh, they don't eat enough. Playing all the time or doing something. So,
if they would be really hungry, they would ask for it, right?
That's right.
I have a question about sort of the appearance of food and whether there's a way to change sort of the attitude that every apple has to be completely perfect and unbruised, and if there's any movement to sort of educate people about ugly produce and it's so tasty.
There's definitely been a shift culturally, I think, to be more accepting of it. I mean, we're not there, but a lot of supermarkets are starting to have sections where you can buy the ugly fruit or ugly vegetables. Because I mean, you're right. Like, we're wasting tons of stuff because it doesn't look perfect, and often we're trading off that perfect look for taste. Like with the red delicious apple that I don't think anyone loves, but looks really pretty. And so we see that over and over. But I think there's a growing recognition that, you know, it doesn't have to look like something in a picture. But yeah, I at the same time, like, tons of my friends, like, sure, wouldn't buy a bruised pepper because they'd rather get one that looks perfect.
Single banana, that's good as well.
Going back to your point on the packaging, coming from, I'm in the packaging department. So usually, depending on the food product, the packaging is about 5 to 10% of the total impact of the food product. But the common misconception is that the packaging is bad because that's what we see in the oceans and that's what goes to landfills. But realistically, if you look at the life cycle of the whole food product, the package is preserving that food product and extending its shelf life, therefore reducing the total environmental footprint of the food product. So by changing colors and whatnot, when the food goes bad, for consumers who are afraid that their senses aren't going to tell them if the food is safe to eat, which is a huge concern with people throwing away food, is food safety. I think that packaging can ultimately reduce food waste, one, by extension of shelf life, and two, by educating consumers on how the gases, you know, from that food product are, at what levels there are, and whether that food is safe to eat or not. Granted, that's not true for all products, like maybe cereals or rice, but products like meat and dairy that have, you know, a large environmental footprint because of the resources that you have to put into them, more packaging can actually reduce the environmental footprint of the whole food product.
That includes the whole not recyclable to the equal standard of the packaging of the plastic, because you can always just downcycle plastic, basically, right?
Yeah, that's without taking recyclability into account. So that's
okay.
assuming that it's all being landfilled. It's it would still reduce the total impact as long as you're extending the shelf life due to the fact that meat and dairy products require so many resources. You know, you have to feed the cow, you need to have water.
Don't tell that to the NGOs. They really like to push that plastic is bad.
Yes,
there's some very cool research on campus, and I forget the professor's name, although somebody else might know. But I was on a panel with him not too long ago. Well, a long ago, like a year ago, so it's not terrible. But he's working on more compostable plastics, like plastics that break down in a much shorter time. And I just was very intrigued by it.
He was here.
He's
my professor.
Oh, what's his name?
Cool. I think Rafael Oras might be him. That's what he works on.
But those only break down in like professional.
Yeah, it has to be a commercial composting facility.
I can't throw it on my composting backyard.
It has to be a specific temperature, and you have to have certain microorganisms. But mostly, it's the temperature that affects the compost piles that are, you know, industrial at much higher temperatures than the one in your backyard. So it just wouldn't break down in your backyard compost pile. Oh, and also going back to the point of education, I just find it interesting that it seems like there's less and less like cooking classes in schools, which it's sad to me as someone who loves to cook that, you know, we're pushing only technical skills and not life skills, which you use on a daily basis. Like, you have to eat every day. You don't necessarily have to know who was the 42nd president every day, right? So it just doesn't make sense to me why we don't push more for things like knowing how to cook at home.
Well, not all hope is lost in that area, because the home ec programs you probably have heard, you know, you heard about in K-12 schools, or really more like high schools, while they don't really exist anymore as such, they've moved to the ISD level. So the Intermediate School District usually handles them under its umbrella of skills programs. So I can give one shout out. My younger son goes to the Wilson Talent Center, which is Ingham ISD's center, and he does precision machining. He loves that program. Right next door, a culinary arts program. And so you actually get kids who are junior and seniors learning how to cook, but preparing them for a career in cooking. So yeah, you lose some of the home stuff, but then you've turned up the notch on some of the commercial cooking. So I think a lot of schools just went, it's more marketable anyway, let's teach the kids more how to do it in a commercial kitchen. So not all hope is lost in there, but yes, I'd love to cook myself. I'm like, yeah, I wish more kids would know that. Totally agree. To your earlier concern, the very first one you had about, what was it? You actually were talking about the very first, not the packaging one. What was the other one you had? Oh yeah, and the culturality and the food and learning about food and what their tastes are. And not to be a complete spokesman for USDA, but another USDA program that's really got a lot of success is something we call Team Nutrition. Team Nutrition focuses on bringing health education and nutrition education to schools for the consumption of the adults, but also for the good of the students. So it actually trains the trainer kind of thing. And one of our big partners actually is MSU Extension. So MSU Extension trainers and coaches go into schools and they assist educators in getting like more health education, more nutrition education to be part of the life of the school. And through that program, we have stuff that actually targets younger learners and getting them to try new foods, especially new fruits and vegetables. So what we haven't kind of touched on yet today is the notion of equity. This is a very important piece to this, is that we, again, we're very lucky people. We had bagels, again, greeting us when we walked in, but that's not the experience of our students in inner cities, nor is the experience of our students in our far-flung rural areas like the UP. You mentioned 1 in 5 kids have food insecurity in Michigan. That's about right. Of that 20%, 3/4 of that 20% is students in urban environments. And I'm talking Detroit, Flint, Benton Harbor, inner city Grand Rapids, those things. And then the last quarter of that 20% is actually rural communities. So we actually have food security insecurity that's up in the UP, up northern Michigan, where there are far-flung places. And food insecurity is not just an economic issue, it's actually also a locale issue, geographic issue. You simply can't get to the store that has the good prices because that's 40 miles down the road. So you go to the nearby place whose price is already marked up, and you're getting that crappier food because that's where that's all your dollar can reach, even if you have government assistance. So the notion of equity is important in that because programs like Team Nutrition will help a child attenuate different, help them acquire different tastes than the ones that have been attenuated for them because of their location or their economic disparity, right? So you get a kid having a salad in inner city Detroit school, and they're like, we never have this at home. What is this? This is great. So that's not unfortunately, that's an effort that's growing, but it's an example of how to get to what you were saying too. How are kids being exposed to those foods?
I don't know if it's a question more so than a comment, but something I'm thinking about is when you were mentioning the on-demand food society that we seem to be in, I'm also thinking how far we are from farms compared to previous generations and how we don't really know much about food. Because I think of my family, they're immigrants, and so just cooking with them. I remember one time making a soup with my grandma, and I forget what the vegetable was, and I was about to throw away a piece of it, and she nearly had a heart attack because she's like, "This is the best part. What are you doing?" And I'm like, "Oh, I didn't know I could actually eat this part of the vegetable." And so there's also certain things even just peeling, say, a potato or something. I may not even be cutting it the right way. I'm just wasting a lot of stuff. But I think sometimes we've gotten away from just knowing about the actual fruit or vegetable itself, what to eat, what not to eat, and that causes waste too. So it's more of a problem.
That's a great point. Great.
Yeah, I think you bring up something that I want to talk about. This food waste I mean, if it's like international in Africa, we understand what is happening. People are producing, but the roads are bad. We can't take it to another part of the country where they are starving. But in the US, I'm like, no way.
Yeah.
People are wasting a lot of food, but in the same country, they say 41 million Americans face hunger.
Right.
It might be a problem of distribution, yes, but what is causing such? Is it a weapon? What is causing that?
Shame.
Capitalism.
Sometimes it's shame. Sometimes it's, and I mentioned a little while ago about about de-identifying students. Sometimes people won't come forward and identify themselves as food insecure because there's a stigma about poverty. I mean, that's a bigger specter we would like to admit. The one thing that we try to promote too is something called the community eligibility provision. And basically what that says is that if 40% of your students in a school district or a grouping of schools, however you can group them for the maximum advantage, 40% or more are free reduced lunch, you can actually get reimbursed at a rate of 1.6 times that percent so that all kids can eat free of even having to apply. They don't even have to apply for the free reduced lunch application. So imagine you have a school district if you have a school district that's 62.5%, 1.6 that's 100%. So if you have 62.5% of your kids free reduced lunch, we go into the school, we call the school, we literally contact the school district, what are you doing? Become CEP, all your kids eat free. Nobody has to know who each other is. They don't even know that they're not, they might even not even know that they're free reduced lunch because their parent never had to file the application because you're a CEP school. So we have programs that specifically combat stigma, right, of poverty.
My school, and when we lived in Jackson, our elementary school did that. It was a complete free lunch, except that my child did not eat school lunch, but really wanted a chocolate milk. So they hired a person whose only job was for the kids that didn't get the lunch but wanted the milk to take their 25 cents.
Yep.
And that was a daily staff position.
Yep, that's an a la carte pricing.
I'm like,
Yes.
and their solution when I asked like this is a little ridiculous. They're like, well, have your child get the lunch and give the food away and just keep it. That would be easier.
That sounds dumb as heck, but not totally misguided. If you look at this, I don't have to see this picture very well, this example of a food share bin, where kids can take food they're not going to eat, and under certain rules, the best food share is the ones that actually depict the things. You don't want like a kid take a bite and go, you don't want that. But they depict what can be shared and shared safely under time and temperature controls, right? You actually want that because there are other kids that need more food, aren't getting it at home, even with the free meal, still need more, and want to take from that. Sounds weird, but it actually is good.
I love the shared table.
Yeah, shared tables are awesome. Not every school does them. Like, why not?
Yeah. Any more questions?
I guess.
Sure.
I just wanted to say that that you know we do like a lot of complaining, but it's actually quite amazing that we don't have things like seasonality anymore, thanks to sort of the American system or whatever luck that we've had to be so fortuitous. So I go to these sessions and then I hear so much complaining like, oh, these strawberries in winter, they make me so angry. And I'm like, no, like why would that make you angry? Like that's amazing and that's so great. And to the extent that, you know, we can price in the costs, the environmental costs into the production, then it's not wasteful, in fact. And food waste is not something to be worried about. But yeah, I just wanted to sort of push back against sort of the, you know, these are first world problems. Things are really, really great here. You know, thanks. I really enjoyed all of your points.
All right. Thank you so much for coming to our panelists. I wish there was something like an ugly grocery food store whereas apples, pineapples that don't fit can be sold to us cheap. Like they have
They
like
have
this,
them in France.
Yeah.
these
Oh, yeah.
two juice blenders, the big ones. I go for sales, buy the carrots, but whatever, and just make juice out of that. I mean, I'm happy. Thank you so much. Anyways, thank you so much for coming. But as we go, food for thought, think about it. Let's think about this. What do you think about food waste, engage, and see how we can solve this problem? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I would also like to encourage everyone to take food with you on your way out.
That's right. Get to a zero footprint, you guys.
We have lots of other students here, won't
That's
get
right.
wasted, but please help yourself.
Yeah, I'm Sheril.
Yeah, I have a job.